A man lost in darkness finds God's light, then uncovers the shocking truth about his brother's death. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? Fulton County Jail stood like a bleak monument to human failure and a justice system long past redemption. Hemmed in by forest on three sides and a road to nowhere on the fourth, it looked more like an abandoned factory of suffering than a correctional facility. Towering concrete walls, streaked with rust and slashed by metal grates, seemed to soak in the despair that lingered in the air, heavy enough to seep through the stone itself. Hope didn't live here. It died here. James Williams, though no one called him that anymore, just Jay, had spent the last 12 years inside. In the beginning, he counted the days, then weeks, then months, but eventually even that lost meaning. He stopped scratching lines into the wall, stopped ticking time off on his fingers. The prison didn't just cage you, it burned out everything human until all that was left was survival on autopilot. Jay was short, solid, with thick shoulders and a pair of brows that had forgotten how to relax. His skin had darkened under the merciless prison sun, and his eyes no longer held the spark they once had. Back when he worked a warehouse job and dreamed of saving up to open his own garage. He hadn't started out cruel, but a life full of poverty, his mother's death, constant humiliation, and most of all, the loss of his brother had cracked something in him long before the prison walls ever closed in. The murder charge came when he was 22, a botched robbery at a corner store. An old man hit the floor and didn't get back up. The fall did him in. The court wasn't interested in nuance. The prosecutor, a young, clean-cut white guy with political dreams, painted Jay as a monster in front of the jury. His one-time friend Ronnie, the guy who dragged him into it, flipped fast, offered a teary statement, made a deal, and walked away with a lighter sentence. Not that it mattered. Ronnie landed back inside not long after. Gun possession, assault. Now he was in the same block as Jay, strutting around like he belonged there. Prison suited him. Jay, on the other hand, was just trying not to disappear. Another black man lost to the system, another check in a spreadsheet. That morning started like every other. A loud buzzer rattled through the cell block. Sergeant Gates stomped down the corridor, baton tapping rhythmically against the bars. The man looked like he'd been carved out of red brick, square-jawed, sunburnt, and cold to the core. His face didn't show hate, just exhaustion, and contempt so practiced it had become second nature. "Rise and shine, trash," he muttered at Jay's cell, not even stopping. "Big day today. Church." The last word dripped with mockery as he moved on. Church happened once a month, if that. Local preachers rarely made the drive. It was too far, too thankless. These days it was Father Thomas who came, an old man, gray-haired and worn thin, with a voice that trembled like he wasn't sure anyone was still listening. But he came. Every week, spoke about forgiveness like it still meant something in a place where nobody could forget, let alone forgive. Jay didn't believe. Most of them didn't. But when his cellmate, a skinny Latino named Luis, murmured, "Let's just go. It ain't about God. It's about being in a different room for an hour." Jay surprised himself by nodding. The church was an old utility shed, once used for tools and spare parts. Now it had a few wooden benches, a handmade wooden cross, and a faint smell of mold and old dust. A slice of light cut through a grimy skylight above, like heaven hadn't quite given up. The inmates sat in silence. Some closed their eyes. Some twitched, restless. Others stared up, like they were hoping the ceiling might crack open and swallow them whole. Father Thomas stood behind a makeshift altar, reading from a battered Bible. His voice quivered, but he held on, stubborn like someone who refused to give up even when nobody cared. "Forgiveness," he said, "is not weakness. It's the strength to rebuild what's been broken. We'd all messed up, every one of us. But forgiveness didn't set you free. It just gave you a reason to breathe while still locked in a cage. Jay listened, not because he believed. Forgive. Forgive who? Himself? Ronnie? The courts? The world that chewed him up and spit him out? Why? So he could keep waking up at 6 a.m. and being called garbage? But something in the priest's voice hit a nerve. The air felt suddenly thick, like it was pushing against his chest. His breath caught. His mind flicked back. Martin, his little brother. They used to be inseparable, until the streets split them up. Martin wanted to be a teacher, wrote poems, got shot waiting for a bus, caught in the crossfire between two gangs who didn't even know his name. And then Jay heard a voice, not with his ears, inside, gentle, familiar, like when Martin used to read to him under the covers. "You're still alive, Jay. That means it's not over yet." Jay flinched, looked around. No one else moved. Father Thomas kept talking, but Jay didn't hear him anymore. His hands trembled. Something stirred inside him. Not rage, not hopelessness, shame. That darkness he'd lived in wasn't just outside him. He'd let it inside, let it claim him. He'd become part of it. But now something deeper was asking, no, begging for a way out. Not for freedom, just for a chance to do one thing right. The service ended. The men shuffled out. Jay stayed. Father Thomas, gathering his books, noticed. "You all right, son?" Jay didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, "What if I don't know how to forgive?" The priest didn't miss a beat. "Then start by admitting there's something you need to forgive." That night, Jay didn't go to the yard. He sat in his cell, staring at the ceiling. Louis muttered about dinner. Someone screamed down the hall, but Jay stayed still. It felt like, for the first time in 12 years, he remembered he had a heart. The prison didn't change. Sergeant Gates still barked and bullied. Ronnie still laughed and played king of the block. The system didn't break. It kept humming along just fine. But something inside Jay shifted. He didn't know what it meant or where it would take him. But for the first time in forever, he didn't feel like a stone tossed into a hole. He felt human. James Williams, Jay to everyone who knew him, sat in the last row. His prison uniform, the color of a dying pumpkin, hung loose on his frame. The pockets sagged with age and the collar was slick with wear. His calloused hands, worn from years in the prison laundry, rested on his knees. His eyes, sharp, guarded, darted around the chapel. Jay didn't believe in God or miracles. The whole church thing? A circus act. Like you could pray the blood off your hands. Like you could forget the people you'd lost. Up front, Father Thomas stood by the makeshift altar, a simple wooden table draped in a faded gray cloth, with a hand-nailed cross above it. The priest was in his 70s, all bones and weathered skin, but his voice, though quiet and tired, never wavered. He didn't preach like someone selling salvation. He spoke like a man who'd been through enough to know that some things don't heal, but you speak anyway. "Every soul can be forgiven," he said, eyes scanning a room full of men who hadn't believed in anything for a long time. "Even the one who's taken a life. Even the one who can't forgive himself." Jay sat still, his head slightly bowed, something twisted in his chest. He didn't want to listen, didn't want to feel, but something inside was already moving, without his permission. Father Thomas's voice didn't sound like a trick. It carried a kind of honesty that hurt more than any prison baton ever could. When the prayer began, everyone rose. Light slipped through the boarded windows in dusty streaks. The priest asked them to close their eyes. Jay closed his, not out of belief, just so no one would see his eyelids trembling. The prayer lasted a minute, maybe two. Some muttered, others stayed silent. And then it happened. A voice, somewhere between thought and sky. Not loud, not strange, but familiar. Deeply familiar. "Jay, you hear me?" His eyes snapped open. No one was there. Around him, inmates still prayed. Some rocked back and forth. One was crying, but the voice didn't fade. "It's me, Martin." The name hit him like a fist to the gut. Martin, his brother, gone 10 years now, shot in a crossfire while waiting for a bus. Jay was still running the streets back then, carrying an old pistol and dreaming about Atlanta. Martin had been 2 years younger, always smiling, always believing in people, even when they spat in his face. Jay had always wanted to protect him, and failed. "I'm sorry," Jay whispered, before he even realized he'd said it. The tears came fast, unannounced. He thought he'd cried them all out years ago, when their mom died, when the rent was unpaid, when soup from a can was dinner for two. "It's not your fault," the voice said. "You've got to let it go. Live." It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a spotlight from heaven, but something deep inside him cracked, like a rusted gate finally giving way. And something new slipped through. Not salvation, but possibility. Father Thomas ended the prayer. The room shifted. Inmates shuffled back to their seats. Jay clung to the bench like letting go might make it all disappear. He didn't even notice the priest walking toward him. "You all right, son?" Father Thomas asked, voice low and kind. Jay didn't answer. For once, he didn't know what to say. After that service, Jay couldn't just slide back into routine. The world inside those walls hadn't changed. Not really. Sergeant Gates still tossed inmates into solitary for breathing wrong. Guards still stole commissary from new fish and laughed at old men who forgot their names. But Jay had started seeing it differently. He got up earlier, stopped throwing dice in the day room, sat by the window and wrote. No one knew what. Letters to Martin, maybe. Confessions, maybe. He didn't spit at the sermons anymore. He listened. Didn't swallow it all whole, but he listened. Other inmates noticed. At first, they mocked him. Carl, teenager, a skinny black kid with white contact lenses and a mouthful of attitude, called out from the next bunk, "What, you some kind of holy man now?" Jay didn't bite. A few weeks later, Carl slid up beside him, quieter than usual. "Hey, did you really hear somebody?" Jay just nodded. Carl never made fun of him again. 2 more weeks passed. Another Sunday, another service. This time Jay sat closer to the middle. When the prayer began, he closed his eyes. The voice didn't return, but something stayed, warm, unnameable. And for the first time in years, he felt it deep in his chest. He wasn't alone. The rage wasn't eating him alive anymore. He started helping the new guys, showing them how things worked, how not to get chewed up by the system. Sometimes he just sat beside the ones who'd been jumped and said nothing at all. They didn't fear him, but slowly, they started to respect him. One day in a chlorine-stinking room that served as a chapel and a broom closet, Father Thomas looked over at him and said softly, "You don't have to be perfect, James. You just can't be who you were." And that stuck with him. He wasn't a saint, but he was no longer the same man. A week passed since that strange day when Jay heard Martin's voice. In prison, time moved weird. Days dragged out like ghosts. Nights drained you. But now there was something new in Jay's head. A silence that meant something. A silence that stayed. He couldn't unhear what was said, not by the priest, but by the one who was gone, the one he couldn't save. That morning was like every other. Metal doors, barking guards, head counts, cold trays. Jay stood in the mess hall, staring at the sludge they called mashed potatoes. He didn't argue with fate anymore, but he wasn't ready to surrender to it either. He looked at the men around him not as criminals, but as broken people. People who still might find their way back. Up on the gallery, Sergeant Gates watched. Broad shoulders, close-cropped gray hair, eyes empty as old asphalt. He was the system in human form. Jay knew what he thought of change. "You're here to rot, not to grow," Gates once said while beating another inmate half to death. But Jay wasn't hiding anymore. Wasn't afraid. Something inside had shifted, and people noticed. Out in the yard where gray uniforms floated between workout bars and cracked benches, Jay spotted Rick, a skinny 20-year-old junkie busted for breaking and entering. Rick barely spoke. He stuttered, kept his eyes on the ground, got slapped around more than most. Jay walked over, quiet, sat beside him. "You don't have to be what they say you are," he said gently. "I started with theft, too." Rick didn't answer, but his chin quivered, and that was enough. From that moment on, even without words, something began to change. Something small, but real. Jay showed up alone to the evening service. He wasn't expecting a miracle. He just needed to figure out what the hell was happening inside him. Father Thomas was already there, waiting by the door of the prison chapel, a crumbling, narrow room with creaky wooden pews and an altar buried under a film of dust. The windows, long stripped of glass, were covered with rusted iron bars. The fading light of sunset filtered through them, and candles along the walls flickered softly, as if time had stopped in this place. "You came back, my son," the priest said with a quiet smile. "You know, no one walks through those doors by accident, not even in here." "I didn't come for God," Jay muttered. "I came because I'm tired of the silence inside me." He sat down in a pew and stared ahead. The sermon began, but the words floated past him. He wasn't listening. He was thinking. And for the first time in years, he felt alive. Not with rage or fear or hate, but with something quieter, something that made him bow his head. And slowly, silently, he began to pray. Not with his lips, with his thoughts. He owned up to his guilt, not to the court, but to himself. In the days that followed, something shifted. Jay stopped fighting, stopped snapping back at every word or shove. At first, it made him look weak, vulnerable. But then something strange began to happen. The air around him changed. Even the men who used to laugh in his face started keeping their distance, sensing that Jay wasn't the same anymore. One afternoon in the prison library, Bobby Tin shuffled over to him, an old-timer, half-blind and 30 years into a life sentence. "I hear you've been fixing people," Bobby said with a dry rasp. "That a new hobby, preacher?" Jay shook his head. "Not fixing, just being there. Back then, when I fell, no one was." Bobby scratched his beard. "Gates ain't gonna like it. Calls guys like you saints with a death wish. He breaks them. You're next." Jay met his eyes, calm. "He can try," and Gates did try. A few weeks later, the CO summoned Jay to a back office. Chipped paint peeling from the walls, the stink of mold and cheap disinfectant thick in the air. A plastic cup of stale coffee sat beside a yellow folder with Jay's name on it. "Williams," Gates said, lounging behind the desk with a smirk. "Word is you're the prison chaplain now, giving sermons, healing souls." He leaned forward. "Think that'll get you out early? Or are you just clearing your conscience?" "I'm not doing this for release, and I'm sure as hell not doing it for you." Gates stood up, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them. "There's no room for hope in here, you hear me? Hope gets you killed. Weakness gets you torn apart." "Then let 'em tear," Jay said, not flinching. "But I'm not living the way I used to." Gates stared at him for a long second, then walked out without another word. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Word spread fast in Block B, but Jay didn't start preaching. He just showed up. When someone needed a hand in the library, he helped. When a guy was jumped and left bleeding, Jay brought him water, shared his food, gave up his blanket on cold nights. And when he spoke, it was never about God. It was about forgiveness, the kind that starts with yourself. Not everyone was buying it. Ronnie Jackson, the guy Jay used to run with, wasn't having it. They'd robbed a store together once, got caught. Jay never told the court it was Ronnie's idea, too. Never even looked at him after that. They hadn't spoken in years. But now Ronnie stood in front of him, arms crossed. "You trying to play martyr now?" he sneered. "Think it makes you clean?" Jay looked at him calmly. "I'm not a martyr, just tired of living in the dark." Ronnie didn't say another word, just walked away. But after that, the hatred in his eyes was gone. One Sunday, Father Thomas paused in the middle of his sermon and looked out over the room. Sometimes, he said, the ones who've seen the deepest darkness become the brightest guides, not because they're strong, but because of the pain they've carried. All eyes turned to Jay. He didn't smile, didn't react. He just sat there, knowing every word was true. Over the months, Jay changed. Not overnight, and not completely, but enough. He forgave himself, and he started to forgive others too. He stopped waiting for someone to come save him. He became someone who could save someone else. 16 years. That's how long James J. Williams had been locked up. 16 years of metal doors, sleepless nights, and watching his past replay like a broken tape. And then, one gray morning in April, a guard at Wilkins County Correctional opened the gate and said two words, "You're free." Jay didn't step out like a hero. He stepped out like a man being pushed into a world that had long since moved on without him. No one waited for him on the other side of the fence. No family, no friends, just an empty bus stop, a cracked road, and a silence so deep it felt like the world didn't know what to say to him. He wore the same threadbare prison clothes and a gray jacket a chaplain had given him. In his pocket, a few documents, his release certificate, 2 meal vouchers, a list of shelters, and $40 in cash. That was it. That, and the invisible scars stitched across his soul, and one tiny pulse of hope that refused to die. He landed in the northern part of the state, a worn-out industrial neighborhood, once filled with black working-class families, now hollowed out by unemployment, drug wars, and slow decay. Broken warehouses, boarded-up liquor stores, church buildings left to rot. It all looked familiar, but distant, like watching your old life through dirty glass. Finding work? Nearly impossible. Every resume hit a wall the moment they read, "Former inmate." Jay still tried. He walked the streets with a folder under his arm. His only job experience? Doing laundry at the prison. He scrubbed dishes in a greasy diner, loaded boxes in a warehouse, got fired after a customer complaint. He stayed at a halfway house, then rented a bug-infested room with no heat. Some nights he'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing Martin's voice, his brother, echoing through the dark. Not the voice from church, the younger one, raw, panicked. "Why didn't you protect me?" Jay never had an answer, but not everything was bleak. There were moments, people, like Carolyn. He met her through a re-entry program at St. Jude's Church. She ran support groups, helped ex-cons get IDs, housing, jobs, even though she barely made enough to cover her own rent. Early 30s, tall, lean, curly hair cropped short. Her face had a kind of quiet strength. Not soft, but real. Earned. She listened, really listened. Didn't judge, didn't interrupt, just showed up. And that shook Jay more than he expected. For the first time, someone looked at him. Not the convict, not the file, not the number, but him. "You're not a killer, Jay," she said one day, her voice low. He snapped. "Doesn't matter. The court said I am. That's enough for most people." "I'm not most people," she replied. They kept seeing each other, sometimes at church, sometimes over coffee, sometimes just walking. Jay started volunteering, fixing pipes at shelters, helping clean up, teaching others how to write resumes and survive interviews. People started to recognize him, not as an ex-con, as a man who chose to rise when everything in the world told him to stay down. There was always a tension in him, a tight coil that never fully unwound. He still couldn't sleep without the lights on, still afraid everything might fall apart. Still didn't trust people, at least not deep down. Didn't believe he deserved a future. But he kept going, kept trying, every single day. Some days it was hell. Inside, Jay wrestled with two voices. One, dark and familiar, whispered, "Let it go. You don't matter." The other, faint but steady, said, "You can make it right." It was that second voice that won the day he finally decided to talk to Ronald Jackson, the same man who'd pulled him into the robbery that landed him in prison. Ronnie was out now too, on parole, working a window washing job he barely held on to. They ran into each other on a bus. At first, Ronnie pretended not to recognize him, but then he walked over and asked, straight up, "You hate me?" Jay looked at him for a long moment. "I hated myself for a long time," he said, "but not anymore. And none of that matters now." That moment wasn't about freedom from prison. It was freedom from anger. And that kind of release meant more than any open gate ever could. But America in the 90s didn't believe in second chances, especially not for black men with a record. Jay felt it everywhere. Cops would stop him just for walking down the street. Security guards would trail him through grocery aisles like he might snatch a banana. On the bus, people gave him nervous glances. Kids would cross to the other side of the road when he walked by. Even at church, where folks hugged him during the service, some avoided eye contact when he tried to strike up a conversation. It wasn't hate. It was something quieter, a kind of refusal to see him at all. Jay knew the truth. He was free, but not accepted. And yet Carolyn was still there. One day after he got turned down from yet another job, she looked him in the eye and said, "Jay, you can be whoever you want, but you've got to forgive yourself, same way you forgave everyone else." Those words hit different. Not a job, not a roof over his head, not even love had shifted him like that sentence. Because without peace inside, there is no freedom. Things started to feel steady. He had a small apartment, a job with a community foundation, books on his nightstand, and Carolyn beside him. But every night, when he turned off the light, the same image returned. Martin. He still hadn't closed that wound, still hadn't found the truth. And until he did, he knew there was no moving forward. Martin hadn't died in some random street shooting. Jay felt it in his bones. Years ago, he'd accepted the official story because he didn't have the strength to question it. Now he did. He pulled out an old folder filled with newspaper clippings, photocopied police reports from his lawyer, and started digging. The next week, he planned a trip back to the neighborhood where Martin had been killed. He knew it would hurt, but he couldn't keep living in the dark. The first lead came out of nowhere. A guy named Ray, someone Jay was mentoring, casually mentioned a name, Dynamite Joe. Jay froze. "Say that again?" "I just said I heard Dynamite Joe was hanging around Kings Park back in '92. Word was someone got marked. I was like 12 then, but the block was buzzing." Kings Park. That's where Martin had been shot. Jay knew that name, Dynamite Joe. Joe Ellis, a low-level dealer back in the day, then a police informant. Then he vanished. Guys like that didn't last. They either got taken out or disappeared for good. But in '92, Joe was there. Jay started poking around, quietly, carefully. Prison had taught him how to ask questions without sounding like he was asking questions. He went to Kings Park, pretending to be apartment hunting, talked to the guys at a local garage. Word was Joe's crew used to meet there. Most folks kept their mouths shut. But one day an older mechanic, maybe in his 60s, looked at Jay and said, "Your brother, right? Martin?" Folks respected him. They covered that up too clean, too fast. That was the boiling point. Jay went home and couldn't sleep. Carolyn sat beside him when he finally said it out loud. "I think my brother was killed on purpose. He knew something, or someone." "Jay," she started, then stopped. "You sure you're ready for this?" "I can't live without knowing." The next night, Jay got access to the county courthouse archives. Carolyn helped him get in, posing as a volunteer from the nonprofit. The place was full of dusty boxes, faded photos, forgotten files. He found Martin's case report, just a couple of pages. No neighbor interviews, no suspects named. It looked like it had been closed in a day. One name stood out, Detective Edward Shelton. He worked South Atlanta back in the '90s, retired now. Jay tracked him down through a law enforcement veterans database. Shelton was living in a trailer, face swollen from years of drinking. When Jay introduced himself, the man slammed the door. But 2 days later, around dusk, Shelton called. "Come by," he said. No games, no bullshit. Shelton laid it out. "We got called in for a teenager shot in the back. 30 minutes after we showed up, I got a call. Close the case. Mark it as a random shooting." I asked who gave the order. My boss just clammed up. "Later, I found out your brother had been seen near the courthouse the day before, talking to someone from the DA's office. That guy got reassigned real quick after Martin died." Jay's blood ran cold. This wasn't some street beef gone bad. This was a cleanup job. Martin had seen something. Maybe corruption. Maybe he was ready to talk. Either way, someone wanted him gone. Jay drove to Atlanta. A big-name criminal lawyer, someone Carolyn had introduced him to at a justice conference, agreed to review the case. 2 weeks later, the lawyer called. "We found something," he said. "Your brother was a witness in a police corruption case. He was supposed to testify. Then he disappeared. And then he died. The case was buried like he never existed." Jay had a choice. Let it go or dig deeper. He chose to dig. He gave an interview to a reporter from an independent paper, a young woman named Nina Clark. Sharp, brave, not afraid to touch the dirty stuff. The headline read, "The Witness They Buried, James Williams and the Death of His Brother." The story caught fire, not nationwide, but loud enough in the county. The police tried to shut it down, but activists picked it up, demanded a reopening of the corruption cases. Internal affairs started sniffing around. Old names started surfacing. Jay didn't feel proud. He wasn't after revenge or fame. He sat in his kitchen late one night, nursing a mug of cheap coffee, staring out the window. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just an ex-con anymore. He was a man who stood up, not out of rage, but because he wasn't afraid anymore. He'd once heard his brother's voice in church. Now he heard it every day, inside himself. August 1998, South Georgia. A dusty back road cut through tall weeds and summer heat, leading to a tired old building on the edge of town. It looked like the kind of place even time had forgotten. Peeling paint, sagging roof, a crooked flag barely holding on. This was the police substation. Inside those faded brick walls were the archives, files that had haunted Jay Williams for months. Now he stood at the door, heart beating like it had its own agenda. His hand trembled, not out of fear, but from the weight of what he might finally uncover. He had made it, right to the edge of truth. Almost 5 years had passed since Jay walked out of prison, and what a road it had been. Most people with his record didn't make it a year outside, let alone turn their life into something meaningful. But Jay, he'd become a mentor, a guide, a steady hand for those just like him, broken, ignored, forgotten. He gave them food, a bed, but most importantly, he gave them hope. And through all of it, Carolyn had been there, the one person who looked past his record and saw the man he'd become. She didn't see an ex-con. She saw a man learning how to love in a world that had tried to crush every last bit of it out of him. But even now, there was one wound that refused to heal. Martin, Jay's older brother, his protector, his North Star, the one who stood between him and every punch life threw. Martin had been gunned down when Jay was still a teenager, and though Jay had heard his brother's voice echo through a prison chapel years ago, had felt it change him from the inside out, he knew he'd never be truly free until he understood what happened that night. The archive room was cold, smelled like mildew and dust. A bored-looking white woman sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, barely glancing at him as he walked in. When she saw his dark skin, the tension in his jaw, the way he carried himself, her eyes narrowed. "What do you need?" she asked flatly, without even pretending to be friendly. "There was a shooting. 9th and West, 1982. Victim's name was Martin Williams. Case was opened, closed real quick." "I need to see the file." She scrolled through a logbook, eyebrows low. At first she said no. Rules, red tape, whatever. But then Jay dropped the name of a civil rights attorney from the nonprofit he worked with, and her attitude shifted, not by much, but enough. She disappeared into a back room. 20 minutes later, she returned with a dusty cardboard box. Inside, faded documents, black and white photos, old interview notes. Jay sat down at the table and read every page like it was scripture. One witness described two men in uniform. One was definitely local police. The other, unidentified. The bullets matched service ammo. And the kicker, no forensic report, no deep investigation. The whole thing had been wrapped up in under a week and labeled a gang conflict. Jay just sat there for a long time, the file open in front of him, his fists clenched. Over the next few weeks, he tracked down people who used to know Martin, old friends, co-workers, neighbors. Most of them were gone. Some wouldn't talk. But one elderly man, a former janitor from the garage where Martin used to work, remembered him. Your brother, he wasn't quiet. He saw what those cops were doing, running drugs through the neighborhood, shaking people down. They told him to keep his mouth shut. He went to internal affairs anyway. 3 days later, he was dead. Rage burned in Jay's chest like a second heartbeat, but he knew better now. Revenge wouldn't change a damn thing. He'd spent years learning that destruction is easy. It's what the system had trained him for. But building? That was the real challenge. And when he found himself slipping toward that edge again, Carolyn's words pulled him back. Truth isn't a scream, Jay. It's a decision. You can stay quiet or make sure someone else doesn't have to. He considered filing a lawsuit, but the case was cold. The evidence buried or lost. So he went another route, the only one that still held power, the truth spoken out loud. It started at a local university where Jay had been invited to speak about re-entry and redemption. But instead of giving the usual talk, he told Martin's story. The room went quiet. You could hear a pin drop. The next week, a regional newspaper ran a story on it. Former inmate seeks justice for brother killed in 1982. A local news station followed up with a segment. Then came interviews. First small podcasts, then regional radio. Jay didn't shout. He didn't blame. He just laid out the facts. The police reports, the inconsistencies, the names. The story hit a nerve. 2 months later, the department launched an internal investigation. A retired officer, now old and frail, cracked under the pressure. He admitted to being part of a so-called cleanup crew, a unit that used any excuse to remove problem people from the area. He didn't name names, but he confirmed what Jay had always known. Martin wasn't some random victim. He was a threat, because he told the truth. That night, Jay came home to the small wooden house he and Carolyn had built just outside town. She met him on the porch, eyes shining with something between joy and relief. "You did it," she whispered. "He'd be proud of you." Jay didn't say anything at first, just took off his jacket, sat on the steps, and looked out at the horizon. The sunset was soft and wide, like time itself had decided to pause. He didn't feel victorious. He felt still. He thought about that prison chapel, the first time he prayed, about Martin's voice breaking through the silence, about all the men behind bars with no one left to speak for them. And he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. A year later, Jay and Carolyn opened the Martin Williams Community Center. Free classes, legal aid, beds for anyone who needed shelter, no sermons, no judgment, just a door, open wide for anyone who needed it. One day, a teenager came in, bruised up, bleeding, scared. "They kicked me out," he gasped. "I didn't do anything. I was just walking home." Jay sat beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "I know. You're safe now." Later that week, the same music Jay once heard in prison played in a small church. Soft keys, a quiet choir. White folks, black folks, former inmates, mothers, kids, all standing shoulder to shoulder. Jay, in a simple white shirt, stepped to the pulpit and read, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean excusing what was done. It means letting go of the pain someone left inside you. He paused, looked out into the room. Some cried, some just stared back, locked in the moment. Then he whispered, "Martin, you live in every person who found the strength to keep going." And in that moment, there was no more pain in his eyes. Only peace. Jay's life wasn't just about escaping the dark. It was proof that even after the system breaks you, faith can rebuild. That the past isn't a sentence if you find the courage to turn back and help someone else forward. So if you're hearing this now, wherever you are, remember, real strength isn't about shouting loudest. It's about listening hardest. Stories like Jay's don't happen in movies. They happen here, next door, across the street, in your city. And if this one moved you, stick around. There are more to come, stories of faith, redemption, forgiveness, and the quiet power of simply not giving up. Because maybe, just maybe, one of them will sound like your own.